Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little grim. But don't worry, you're already doomed the moment you cross the threshold of this turf house kitchen. You realize the air itself is out to get you. It tastes like 1,000 years of smoke, sour whey, and something uncomfortably close to wet sheep. Your eyes sting in the dimness. You can't quite tell if the haze is from the low fire in the stone hearth or the general ambience of ancient, cooking disasters. A slab of driftwood leans against the wall, pocked with old axe scars and slick with a sheen you'd rather not analyze. Your feet sink into packed earth. Still cold despite the wavering flames. Someone, maybe you, has spread rushes on the floor, but they crunch underfoot like dry insect wings. In the center of the room sits the cauldron, a black iron relic suspended from an iron hook. It looks big enough to swallow you whole, and probably would, if it got the chance. Steam trickles up to vanish among the low beams. A single slit of a window admits a stripe of twilight that lands across your knuckles. Already numb from carrying your bundle of dried fish and roots, you can feel the cold sneaking up your sleeves, despite your best efforts at leering. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but so are your neighbors. So at least you're not missing any calls. You set your basket down near the hearth and glance around. Every surface is layered with fine soot. In one corner, a heap of seaweed waits for its moment of glory. On a shelf, a few precious slabs of rock salt glint like misplaced treasure. You probably won't survive this week, but at least you'll be well-seasoned. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is for you, just so I can imagine your cozy sofa while you imagine this damp cavern of a kitchen. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stoop to examine the hearth more closely. The stones radiate a ghost of warmth, the kind that leaves your palms tingling, but never quite through your fingertips. Smoke snakes along the ceiling beams, curling round a dangling bundle of dried herbs, mostly angelica. Though something spiny and unfamiliar juts out among the leaves, the smell is herbal, faintly medicinal, and only slightly better than the sour stink drifting from the cauldron. Historians still argue whether these homes were designed to retain heat or simply punish the occupants for existing. You shuffle over to the rough-hewn table that serves as both prep space and communal bench. A crust of something unspeakable clings to the edge, resisting your half-hearted attempts to scrape it off with your thumbnail. Remember that damp tunic you put on this morning? It's still there, hugging your skin with a clammy affection you can't shake. Outside, the wind keens against the turf walls. Every few minutes, the door shudders on its latch. You can almost pretend the place is alive, breathing in the gusts and sighing them back out through invisible cracks. The only consolation is the thin warmth that pulls round your ankles whenever you inch closer to the fire. Your hands stray to the basket again, checking the supplies. You've got dried cod, a fist-sized hunk of barley bread, a small sack of moss for a thickening, and a precious stub of whale blubber. That last one gleams in the half-light, its texture a cross between candle wax and regret. You'd give anything for a fresh apple, but in this land of wind and rock, fruit is a fantasy. The single iron pot dominates your thoughts. It's never truly clean, just momentarily less filthy. Some say it's better this way, a perpetual seasoning of generations. Others claim it's a hazard that shortens your life by decades. You suspect both are true. When you lift the lid, a damp breath of steam greets you, carrying notes of salt, fish oil, and a tang that could strip varnish. A shallow wooden bowl waits near the hearth, scored with knife marks. You run a thumb over the ridges and wonder how. Many people have tried and failed to make dinner here without losing hope. Historians debate whether the turf house kitchen was a place of resilience or a monument to collective suffering. You suspect the answer is yes. You crouch to coax the embers with a bit of dry moss. Sparks jump, winking out before they can do much good. Your face prickles with the sudden heat, and for a moment, you allow yourself to imagine modern life fluorescent. Lighting, central heating, microwaves that beep in triumph. Then the moss flares into smoke and you cough yourself back to reality. There's no escaping the draft. It creeps up from the gaps between the stones, swirls round your ankles, and wins its way to your spine. You pull your tunic tighter and consider the stew again. The ladle more of a carved stick than a proper tool rests in a groove along the pot's rim. You take hold of it gingerly, stirring the thick sludge inside. One turn, two, and a chunk of something pale and lumpy surfaces. Maybe fish. Maybe last week's fish. You don't ask questions, you don't want answered. In the corner, a wooden bucket of sour whalings against the wall. You'll have to warm it later if you want anything resembling drink. For now, the priority is not freezing to death while you pretend this is a normal meal. Remember the rushes underfoot? They're damp again, weaking cold through the soles of your shoes. You shift your weight and wonder how people stayed sane here. Night after endless night, the fire catches, throwing flickering shadows against the walls. In that dancing gloom, the kitchen feels timeless, a place where centuries overlap and every meal tastes faintly of desperation. You reach for the barley bread and break off a chunk, watching crumbs scatter onto the soot-blackened stones. The hearth sighs as you lean closer. And for just a moment, you think you hear voices whispering in the smoke. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's your imagination. Either way, it's not offering to help. Your stomach growls, you sigh. This is dinner, Medieval Iceland style, and you've only just begun. You leave the half-stirred pot to its own devices and duck back outside, bracing against a wind that feels like it's trying to flay you in a slow, methodical way. It cuts under your tunic, finds the tender skin at the nape of your neck, and settles in like an unwanted guest. Your hands go instantly stiff, fingers aching round the handle of your crude little gathering basket. If you thought the inside of the turf house was unwelcoming, the landscape beyond is a study in committed hostility. The path down to the driftwood piles is really just a suggestion carved by generations of equally reluctant cooks. It weaves along the edge of a black stony beach where the sea hurls itself over and over against the rocks, like it's determined to swallow the island whole. You pick your way across patches of crusted snow and drifted sand. Remember the last time your shoes were dry. It was probably sometime in another century. At the high tide mark, bleached logs sprawl in tangled heaps, each more splintery and awkward than the last. You set your basket down and try to decide which chunks are dry, enough to burn without choking you out. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of timber here was more of a trade problem or an ecological inevitability. But you don't have time to debate. Your main concern is whether you can heave one of these logs back up the path without losing a limb to frostbite. You drag-a-likely cannot it free, feeling it grind over the pebbles with a sigh that sounds far too human. The surface is pitted and streaked with salt, and it smells faintly of ancient kelp. You wedge it under one arm and turn to collect dry dung, an ingredient in tonight's dinner you'd rather not think of. Bowed too hard, even the best fires need help staying lit. A low wall of turf marks where sheep used to huddle against the worst storms. You kneel by it, fingers scrabbling through brittle grass and pebbles until you find a cache of pressed dung cakes. Each one is the size of your palm, light as cork and about as appetizing. You stack them carefully in your basket. They'll burn hot and fast, just enough to coax the driftwood into something like a cooking fire. Meanwhile, Your phone is dead. But you'd trade all the notifications in the world for a single disposable lighter. Your breath comes in short plumes, the cold worming into your chest until every inhale feels like punishment. You take a moment to look at the horizon, nothing, at grey waves and greyer sky. It's the kind of view that seems designed to keep your expectations low. The wind picks up as you start back toward the kitchen. Driftwood balanced over one shoulder, basket of dung bumping your hip. You inch along the rutted track. Every few steps, you have to stop and catch your breath, and you notice that the toes of your shoes are crusted with frost. Remember the rushes that were damp inside. Out here, you'd kill for something that merely felt damp instead of actively frozen dot at the door. You shoulder the driftwood inside, wincing as the end knocks against the lintel. The hearth is still smoldering, a reluctant glow in the gloom. You crouch and range the precious sticks, adding a few cakes of dung like unholy seasoning. A spark leaps up, and you shield it carefully with your body, coaxing it with shallow breaths until the flames catch. The warmth is meager but immediate. Your hands tremble as circulation returns. 1,000 needles stabbing your skin, you set the basket aside and nudge the driftwood deeper into the fire, hoping it lasts long enough to soften the fish you'll be eating whether you want to or not. In one corner of the kitchen, a heap of brittle seaweed waits to be burned or boiled. It's not always clear which is preferable. The smoke from the new fire curls round it, mingling with the already thick air. You can't help thinking how much simpler life would be if you could just plug in an electric stove. Historians still argue whether the resource scarcity here inspired innovation or just a collective lowering of standards. You stand and stretch your back, feeling each vertebra complain. The wind outside rattles the walls, and you realize this is the quietest it's been all day. That doesn't mean it's quiet, only that your ears have adjusted to a constant roar. Near the door, a crude rack holds a few iron tools. You take down a hook-ended poker and prod the logs. Watching embers skitter across the hearthstone, the driftwood hisses and pops, releasing a sour tang you'll be tasting for the next several hours. Remember that damp tunic? Now it's steaming against your ribs, a clammy warmth that might almost feel comforting if it weren't so persistent. You hunch closer to the flames, letting the heat soak into your face while your back stays stubbornly chilled in the faint light. You notice a smear of lichen along one of the hearthstones, a splotch of green in an otherwise colorless room. It's probably harmless, probably. You touch it with one finger, then quickly wipe your hand on your sleeve. Just in case, the fire crackles higher, and you feel a momentary surge of triumph. You've got fuel, a stable flame, and the promise of a hot meal, if you can call it that. It's almost enough to make you feel at home. Almost. The smoke thickens, curling round the rafters in lazy eddies. You take a few cautious breaths and decide it's time to retrieve the fish before the flames burn down again. As you straighten, your knees creak in protest, a reminder that discomfort is your closest companion here. The driftwood snaps with a hollow report, sending sparks up into the shadows for a heartbeat. The kitchen glows bright as a forge. You blink against the sudden glare, and when your vision clears, you're still in the same cold, smoky room. Only now, your hands are dry enough to crack open the next phase of dinner. You shuffle over to the cauldron again, feeling the warmth of your precious fire ebbing away already. The iron pot's rim is crusted with rings of old meals, each layer a fossil record of prior disappointments. You brace yourself and lift the lid. A sour cloud billows out, wrapping round your face like an unwashed scarf. You cough once, twice, and blink tears out of your eyes as the steam settles into your hair. Inside, the stew isn't so much cooking as existing in a permanent state of suspicious readiness. It's a pale sludge flecked with bits you'd rather not inspect too closely. Historians still argue whether families kept a perpetual stew on purpose for efficiency or because cleaning the pot was more than they could justify. Either way, you're about to become part of this questionable tradition. You dip the ladle into the depths. The handle is smooth from generations of hands, and it wobbles ominously when you stir from below. Something dense and gelatinous breaks free and surfaces. You squint, hoping it's a piece of last week's cod rather than something older and more philosophical. Remember that driftwood fire you worked so hard to build. You'll need every flicker of heat it offers to coax this concoction into edibility. You glance round for a place to set the ladle, then realize there isn't one. So you wedge it carefully against the pot's side, the handle threatening to tip into oblivion at any moment. The wind gives the door another hard shove, and you instinctively flinch. The entire kitchen seems to shudder in response. Outside, dusk is slowly settling in, though here that mainly means the grey gets a little darker. Your breath curls into the gloom as you gather the slabs of salted fish. They're stiff as boards, edges whitening with age. You stack them beside the hearth, telling yourself this is preferable to starvation, a low bar, but you're determined to clear it. One by one, you slide the fish into the stew. They slip beneath the surface without a splash, swallowed by the same slurry that's claimed countless meals before yours. The ladle sags a little further, and you catch it just in time. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but you aren't be able to charge it here even if you tried. You imagine a power strip in the corner, a little red light blinking helpfully. Then you remember there's no such thing as electricity in this kitchen, only the dim flicker of flame and the certainty of drafts. The fire licks at the bottom of the pot, sending up the occasional hiss as trapped moisture escapes. You can almost pretend it's progress. The smell is complicated, part briny, part sour, and wholly committed to infiltrating your clothes. You already know you'll carry this scent to your grave, or at least until you find a creek deep enough to scrub it away. Remember the rushes under your feet. They've dried a little in the heat, and now they crackle every time you shift your weight. You consider gathering fresh ones, but dismiss the idea immediately. You have enough to do without replacing your crunchy flooring. You take a step back to survey your domain. The turf house kitchen in medieval Iceland wasn't built for comfort, but it was built to keep you alive, if only barely. The walls are thick, packed with sod and stones, and the roof slants low enough that you keep knocking your head every time you forget to stoop. You run a hand along the rough beam over the hearth, feeling grit collect under your fingernails. The ladle lists again, and this time you let it. It slides slowly into the pot until only the handle sticks out. You sigh, because of course it does. Historians still argue whether the shape of these cauldrons was purely practical or a reflection of some deeper cultural need to make you question your life choices. You retrieve the ladle, tapping it gently against the rim to shake off the excess sludge. A glob falls to the hearthstone with a wet splat. You stare at it for a moment, then nudge it aside with your foot, pretending it didn't happen. From the corner, the dried seaweed seems to watch you, patient and accusing. You know you'll have to add it soon, and the thought fills you with a weary resignation. For now, you busy yourself breaking up a chunk of barley bread, crumbling it into the pot as a token gesture toward thickening the broth. Your stomach grumbles in reply. You are not sure if that's hunger or protest. Either way, you're too tired to care. You lean back against the wall, feeling the chill seep into your spine again, and close your eyes for a moment. When you open them, the stew is still there. The smoke is still coiling in lazy spirals. The wind is still battering the walls. Nothing has improved, but at least nothing has gotten worse yet. You scoop up a little of the stew to test its progress. The taste is predictably awful, a sour burst of fish and salt that coats your tongue like despair. You force it down and remind yourself you'll get used to it eventually. Probably dot outside. The wind shifts again, rattling the turf walls so hard that a clump of sod falls from the rafters and lands near your foot. You ignore it. You're past the point of being startled by the kitchen trying to rejoin the earth. The flames under the pot gutter and flare, and you wonder if you have enough driftwood to last the night. You'll have to ration it carefully, feeding the fire in small offerings like a supplicant at some ancient shrine. Remember that smell from the first moment you walked in. It's worse now, if that's even possible, but you're here, and you're committed, and dinner, if you can call it, that is slowly taking shape. This is your life tonight. A cauldron that never empties, fish that never quite rehydrate, and a hearth that never stays warm. You think about modern kitchens with bright countertops and dishwashers and feel a pang of envy so deep. It nearly swallows you whole. But here, in this cramped, smoky room, you're doing what countless others did before you. Surviving. One ladle of questionable stew at a time. You slide the cauldron lid back into place, feeling its damp weight settle like a judgment. The stew will keep doing whatever it's doing, fermenting, dissolving, conspiring while you attend to the next indignity. With a sigh, you turn to the low shelf where the salted fish slabs wait, stacked like grim invitations to dinner. But tonight isn't just about fish. Tonight, you get the rare pleasure of seabird eggs so fresh they look fossilized. The basket holding them is lined with dried moss, and the eggs themselves are speckled a pale gray that almost matches the walls. You reach for one, covering it carefully as though it might detonate if you breathe too hard. Historians still argue whether these eggs were prized delicacies or last resorts for desperate kitchens. As you run a thumb over the brittle shell, you decide it's probably both. You set the egg down and lift the first slab of fish. It's stiff as a roof tile and nearly as appetizing. Remember that driftwood you carried in? It's burning low. Now, flames licking the iron pot with a sullen glow. You angle the fish so the heat can begin to soften the salted flesh. The surface glistens where salt crystals have begun to sweat under the warmth, leaving little rivulets that look disturbingly like tears. You turn the fish over and nearly drop it as a pungent wave of brine hits your face. Your eyes water. You can taste salt just from breathing. You step back and imagine, fleetingly, a modern fridge where the fish would be wrapped neatly in plastic, all its odors contained. Then you remember there's no such luxury here. If you want dinner, you have to endure the stink. You crouch to feed the fire another scrap of driftwood, then slide a couple of done cakes in behind it. They smolder with a reedy hiss, sending up a smoke so sour it is best unpleasant and into the realm of personal attack. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but you'd give anything for a podcast to distract you from the fact you're basically smoking your dinner like an old leather boot. You look down at the eggs again and feel a pang of doubt. Some of them are slightly cracked, the hairline fractures dark against the pale shell. You pick up the least damaged one and give it a cautious shake. It sloshes inside, the sound not at all reassuring. Remember that damp tunic, the smell of fish has now claimed it fully. There's no going back. You set the egg into a little bowl, then reach for a second fish slab. This one is thinner, but the smell is even stronger. You wonder if it was ever alive or if it emerged from the ocean already half mummified. Historians still argue whether these preservation methods were optimal or simply the only option. When winter stretched half the year, you suspect it's another combination of necessity and low expectations dotted the hearth. The first fish is beginning to sag under its own weight, which counts as progress. You use the iron poker to nudge it aside and make room for the next. Your stomach gives a resigned sort of lurch, hunger and dread fighting for a priority. The seabird eggs require a different strategy. You set a flat stone near the fire to warm, then line up the eggs to cook gently. If you're lucky, they'll firm up before the shells split open. If not, you will be cleaning clumps of half-cooked yolk off the hearth all night as you work. The wind rattles the walls again. A fine silt of ash drifts from the rafters, settling into your hair. You brush it off without thinking. At this point, there's no surface in the kitchen that isn't layered in some combination of soot, salt, and old meals. You crouch to check the fire's progress. The dung burns faster than the driftwood, forcing you to feed it constantly. You think about modern stoves just a twist of a knob. Instant flame and feel a surge of longing that nearly makes you dizzy. Remember the rushes. Underfoot, they've grown brittle in the heat, snapping under your weight every time you shift. It's like walking across a carpet made of stale crackers. You consider replacing them, but decide you'd rather conserve your energy for the next ordeal. You rotate the fish again, using the poker to lift an edge and peek at the underside. It's softening, turning from rigid salt brick to something marginally more edible. The smell is still eye-watering, but at least it smells like food instead of raw preservation. Beside the hearth, the eggs begin to sweat. Tiny beads forming on their speckled shells. You crouch to turn them carefully, feeling the heat seep into your knuckles. One of the eggs gives a faint crackling sigh, and you freeze, waiting to see if it will explode. It doesn't, not yet. Meanwhile, your stomach growls again, louder this time. You can't tell if it's excitement or protest. You shift your weight and stare into the fire, wishing it were brighter, hotter, more reliable. Historians still argue whether these turf house hearths were an engineering marvel or a compromise. That never quite worked. You suspect the truth is hidden somewhere in the smoke. You ease one of the fish slabs onto a scrap of driftwood, letting the heat penetrate from both sides. The flesh is starting to peel away in translucent flakes, which is the closest you'll get to a culinary victory tonight. You glance at the eggs, where fine cracks are beginning to spiderweb across two of the shells. You'll need to eat them soon or surrender to the cleanup. Remember the first moment you stepped into this kitchen? That peculiar blend of salt and smoke has seeped into your bones now. Even if you left, it would follow you, clinging to your hair, your tunic, your very skin. You crouch again to check the fire. It's guttering low, embers winking out one by one. You feed in the last of the driftwood, watching the flames surge and retreat like they can't decide whether to help you or not. When you stand, your knees pop in complaint. You scoop one of the eggs into your palm warm, faintly oily, and set it onto a wooden plate. Another egg follows, a little crack dribbling yolk down the side. You sigh and set it aside, telling yourself it counts as a success that it didn't burst outright. This is dinner. Salted fish you can't quite identify, seabird eggs on the brink of ruin, and a hearth that demands constant attention. Remember that modern fridge you dreamed about. It's a fairy tale here. You're left with this smoke in your hair, salt on your fingers, and a meal that will never quite let you forget where you are. You gather your courage and shift your gaze to the corner shelf where a sack of barley and a smaller pouch of dried moss sit slumped like conspirators. If the fish was the main course, this part is the filler, grinding and mixing until the sludge in the pot grows thick enough to pretend it's nourishment. You sigh and tug the sacks closer, wincing as your back protests with a hot stab of pain. Remember the damp tunic. It's finally starting to dry at your shoulders, just in time for the sweat to start anew. The barley is coarse, each grain a hard little promise of chewing fatigue. You drag a low grinding stone out from under the table, a smooth basalt disc, scarred by years of labor, and settle into work. Historians still argue whether barley was truly the grain of choice here or simply what grew despite the cold. But your hands don't care about scholarly debates. They only know the weight of the stone as you roll it back and forth, scraping the grains to powder. It's a mindless task, but not a quick one. Every pass of the stone produces a little more flour and a lot more shoulder ache. You pause too. Rub the cramp from your wrist, then set to it again. The smell of salt fish and sour smoke thickens with every breath, mingling with the earthy tang of ground barley. You reach for the moss, tipping a handful onto the board, dried and brittle. It crunches under your palm. Some old chronicler claimed it added texture and minerals, whatever that means. You just know it bulks up the stew so you don't feel quite as hollow after eating. You crumble it fine, working it between your palms until it looks like green dust. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead. But if you had it, you'd probably just be scrolling recipes you can't recreate. You imagine a cooking app telling you precisely how to roast a chicken or bake a cake, and it feels like a taunt. Here, you've got moss, barley, and the vague hope you won't starve. You sweep the powdery mix into a wooden bowl. Then scrape the last of the barley from the grinding stone. The grain has left your palms dry and scuffed, little white lines standing out against the pink skin. You flex your fingers, imagining the generations before you doing the same. Night after bleak night, remember the driftwood fire you nursed into existence. It's gutting again, the embers dimming to a sullen glow. You feed it the last of the dried dung, watching it catch with an acrid hiss. The smoke is so thick it feels solid, clinging to your hair and lining your throat with a taste. Like burned nettles, you kneel to stir the cauldron. The fish has broken down into unrecognizable flakes, and the seabird eggs have collapsed into the mix. You sprinkle in the moss and barley, stirring slowly until the sludge thickens. Each turn of the ladle feels heavier, as if the meal is resisting completion. Historians still argue whether moss was seen as a delicacy or a desperation move. You're leaning toward desperation, though you suspect the line between the two was blurry here. You scrape the ladle against the pot's side, dislodging a ribbon of something you choose not to identify. The fire flares briefly, illuminating the walls in a flickering dance of shadows. You can see every crack and stain now. Every place the soot has settled into permanent residence. You wonder if it ever felt clean in this kitchen. You doubt it. Remember those brittle rushes underfoot? They have gone now, ground to dust by your shuffling steps. You can feel bare earth under your heels, cold and unwelcoming. You tell yourself it doesn't matter tonight. Everything is temporary. Even the floor. You set the ladle aside and wipe your palms on your tunic, which only transfers the grime from one surface to another. A dull ache pulses behind your eyes, a mix of fatigue and the smoke's relentless assault. You close them for a moment, just long enough to imagine a modern kitchen with clean counters and bright lights. The fantasy is almost painful. When you open your eyes, nothing has changed. The stew still bubbles sluggishly. The fire still fights to stay alive. The wind outside still throws itself against the turf walls, determined to remind you where you are. You drag the bowl of ground barley closer and sprinkle the last of it into the pot, watching it disappear into the swirl. The smell grows thick, earthy, sour, faintly fishy, and you take a deep breath because there's nothing else to do. Meanwhile, your stomach has stopped complaining. Either it's resigned itself to the weight or it's conserving energy for the next disappointment. You stir the pot one final time, feeling the weight of the mixture drag against the ladle. This is dinner in medieval Iceland. A handful of grains, a little moss, and the perpetual taste of smoke. You lean back against the wall, letting your shoulders sag. Your tunic clings damply to your spine, and your knees are dusted with barley flour. You glance round the kitchen, wondering how anyone endured this for decades. Historians debate whether the monotony of meals bred contentment or quiet despair. You suspect it was both. Remember the first time you tasted fresh bread or ripe fruit? That memory feels far now, as though it belonged to another life. Here, the best you can hope for is a meal that doesn't actively make you gag. You close your eyes again, letting the smoke settle into your hair, your skin, your thoughts. This is survival grinding barley and moss while the wind howls beyond the turf walls. You'd trade every modern convenience for a single moment of warmth that didn't come with the price of soot and salt. And yet, despite everything, you feel a flicker of pride. The pot is full. The fire is holding on. For tonight, at least, you've managed to make something out of almost nothing. You stretch your back, feeling vertebrae pop like damp twigs, and eye the cauldron as if daring it to boil faster. But the stew is locked in its slow transformation, and you still need something to drink, something less likely to peel the lining from your throat than the sludge in the pot. You glance at the barrel of sour whey resting in the corner, its cracked lid balanced precariously. The surface is crusted with a pale film, and when you pry the lid off, the smell drifts up in a clammy wave. You cough, then take a steadying breath. Historians still argue whether whey was genuinely palatable or merely tolerated because the alternatives were worse. You suspect it's another case of collective denial. Beside the whey stands a smaller keg of ale. The ale might be generous. You've heard it described as thin, sour, and prone to unexpected lumps. You lift the lid anyway, because compared to the whey, it's almost appealing. Almost. Remember that damp tunic you thought was finally drying? The steam from the pot has soaked the sleeves again, sticking them to your forearms like an old promise. You can't break. You ignore it and focus on preparing something drinkable. You fetch a wooden dipper and ease it into the ale barrel, careful not to stir the sediment at the bottom. The liquid that comes up is a murky amber, flecked with floating bits you choose not to identify. You set the dipper aside to warm over the hearth, because tepid ale is preferable to the chill that seems determined to gnaw at your bones. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead. But you find yourself wishing for a kitchen time where even the shrill beat would feel more than end. Comforting, here, time is measured by the thickness of the smoke and the ache in your lower back. You set a small pot over the fire and pour in the whey, watching it foam round the edges. A tangy, slightly sweet smell rises, not entirely unpleasant if you don't breathe too deeply. You stand there for a moment, hand on the handle, wondering who first decided this was the best option for a beverage. Necessity is a persuasive teacher. You glance round the kitchen, taking in the soot-caked rafters and the darkened walls. The same routine, day after day, generation after generation. You can almost hear the ghosts of past cooks sighing in sympathy or exasperation. Remember the driftwood you struggled to hold inside? It's nearly gone now. Reduced to embers and ash, you nudge the fire with the poker, coaxing out a last flare of heat. The flames catch on a stray splinter, brightening enough to show the fine layer of grime that coats every surface. You crouch to stir the whey, noting how the foam recedes into a thin film. It won't get much better than this. You ladle some into a wooden cup, the rim darkened by decades of use. You lift it to your lips, pausing to brace yourself, then take a cautious sip. The taste is every bit as aggressive as the smell, sharp, sour, with an aftertaste that clings to your tongue like regret. You swallow and set the cup down, blinking, tears from your eyes. It's technically sustenance, but it feels more like penance. The ale fares only slightly better. Warmed by the hearth, it smells faintly yeasty, with a note of something you'd rather not name. You lift the dipper again, pour a small measure into another cup, and take a tentative taste. It's thin, almost watery, with a bitterness that settles deep behind your teeth still. Compared to the whey, it's practically celebratory. Historians still argue whether these drinks were meant to nourish or merely dull the senses enough to endure another day. You can see the appeal of the latter. Outside, the wind rises again, moaning across the roof in a voice that sounds too deliberate to be only weather. You pull your tunic tighter, feeling the damp fabric cling to your collarbone. The rushes underfoot are nearly gone now, worn to scraps by your pacing. You check the cauldron again. The stew is thicker, a lumpy mass that threatens to seize into a single gelatinous cake if you look away too long. You stir it carefully, scraping the bottom to prevent anything from welding itself to the iron. Remember the first time you lifted the lid? That sour wave of decay. You've almost grown used to it. Almost dot meanwhile. Your stomach sends up another pang. A reminder that even bad food is better than no food. You ladle out a small portion of the stew, letting it slop into a shallow wooden bowl. The fish has dissolved almost entirely, leaving behind a texture that's part porridge, part cautionary tale. You set the bowl aside and pour a measure of ale, telling yourself it will help. Whether that's true is irrelevant. Belief is sometimes more useful than fact. Remember the fantasy of a modern kitchen you entertained earlier? Stainless steel counters, gleaming appliances. Here, you have soot, splinters, and the faint satisfaction of surviving one more step in a process that feels designed to break you. You take another sip of ale, ice half-lidded. For a moment, you let yourself imagine the taste is something richer, smoother, less aggressively disappointing. The illusion lasts just long enough to swallow. You glance round the kitchen. The fire has burned low again, embers blinking like tired eyes. The wind presses against the turf walls, reminding you there's nothing but cold beyond this thin barrier. You set the cup down, wipe your hands on your tunic, and prepare to serve the stew. This is your world now. Sour whey, flat ale, and a meal that might be older than you care to guess. At least it's warm. Mostly you balance the wooden cup on the table and turn to face the hearth, feeling that peculiar mixture of dread and resignation that's become your closest companion in this kitchen. It's time to do something you'd almost forgotten in your haze of grinding and stirring. Feed the family hearth spirit. You've heard that every household keeps a little corner of the fire dedicated to the invisible, being that watches over the home. Some say it's just superstition. Others claim it's the only reason the walls don't collapse in on you. Historians still argue whether this tradition was a genuine spiritual practice or a clever way to ensure nobody ever skipped tidying the hearth. Either way, tonight you won't risk offending whatever ghost might be listening. You crouch low too. The embers, the last scraps of driftwood glowing like buried stars. Your knees pop, and a fine rain of soot drifts onto your hair. Remember that damp tunic. It's finally dried again, but it's absorbed enough smoke to be classified as a preserved meat. You brush your palms clean on your thighs and peer into the shadows where the offering stone sits, blackened by countless tiny sacrifices. You break off a thumb-sized piece of barley bread, what little you can spare, and set it carefully on the stone. The edges catch the heat almost immediately, curling and crisping in the warm air. You whisper nothing, because you don't know the words, and you suspect the spirit understands your intent more than your language. The small joke bubbles. Up in another life, you'd be the person with a candle and a snack on an Instagram altar. Here, the offerings feel much more personal, because the consequences might not be imaginary. You nudge the bread closer to the coals, watching it smolder at the corners. The smell is surprisingly pleasant, a little nutty, almost sweet. For a moment, you can almost pretend it's a treat instead of a desperate bribe to an invisible tenant. Meanwhile, Your phone is still dead, but if it were working, you'd be searching whether you're supposed to bow or just stand here awkwardly. You choose awkwardness, because it's the one skill you've perfected in this kitchen. The hearth spirit tour, the idea of it makes this place feel slightly less lonely. You stand, stretching until your spine crackles, and glance around the cramped room. The air has thickened into a permanent haze, rich with smoke and salt and something older than both. Remember the seabird eggs you cooked earlier? The smell of them still lingers in the rafters, a reminder that nothing truly disappears here, least of all odors. You scoop another ladle of stew into a second bowl. The consistency has finally settled somewhere between gruel and regret. You set the bowl next to the warm meal and consider it your small, temporary victory. The fire flickers low, brightening just enough to cast your shadow onto the turf wall. You watch yourself move, distorted and wavering, like a ghost impersonating a cook. You wonder how many nights were spent this way, a lone figure feeding the hearth, stirring the pot, trying to keep the dark at bay. You check the offing bread again. It's gone black round the edges, curling in on itself. You decide that's probably a good sign if the spirit isn't satisfied by the gesture. It hasn't sent any immediate curses your way. At least, not yet. Outside, the wind hits the wall with a sound like a hand slapping the side of the house. You close your eyes and listen. In the hush between gusts, you think you hear something softer, a sigh, a shuffle, maybe your imagination, filling in the spaces where your mind refuses to stay quiet. You open your eyes and glance down at your tunic, flecked with ash and the ghost of old barley flour. You look like someone who's been here forever, and in a way, you have. Each task blends into the next until the line between evening and night dissolves. Remember the driftwood you gathered in the cold? You're burning the last of it now. Little splinters that pop and crackle as they give up their heat. You kneel to adjust them, feeling warmth kiss your face before the draft steals it away. You pull the lid off the cauldron one last time. The stew doesn't look much different than it did an hour ago. But you tell yourself it's ready. It has to be. You can't keep waiting for a perfection in a place that doesn't believe in it. Historians still argue whether the hearth spirit was a benevolent protector or a petty tyrant that demanded constant appeasement. Tonight, you're willing to hedge your bets. You ease the blackened bread into the embers, watching it vanish into the glow. You stand again, feeling the familiar twinge in your lower back. Your legs are stiff, your fingers raw from handling rough wood and stone, and your hair is stiff with smoke. But for a moment, just a moment, there's a small peace in knowing you've done everything you could. Meanwhile, your stomach tightens with hunger, a low ache that won't be ignored much longer. You wrap your hands round the bowl of stew, letting the heat soak into your palms. This is your offering to yourself, a meal that tastes like entrance. You take a cautious sip of the warm meal. The bitterness has mellowed in the heat. And you almost smile. Almost. You set it aside and look. At the hearth, embers winking up at you like watchful eyes. Remember when you first stepped into this kitchen. You were an intruder then, an outsider. Now you're part of it, soaked in its smells, shaped by its rituals, resigned to its discomforts. This is your dinner hour in medieval Iceland, feeding the spirit, feeding yourself, and hoping both are enough to get you through another night. You ease yourself down onto the narrow bench by the hearth, bowl in hand, and breathe in the stew's sour warmth. It's thicker now, each spoonful clinging to the ladle in a way that suggests it won't come off without persuasion. You dip your spoon and let it hover, delaying the moment of contact with your tongue. Even in here, where everything is some shade of grey or brown, the fish glimmers faintly in the gloom, and oily sheen you can't decide is reassuring or threatening. The wind outside hasn't let up. It prowls round the turf walls like a restless animal, and every so often it presses so hard the beams groan under the strain. Remember the brittle rushes underfoot. What's left of them is being scattered into little drifts, swept round by the draft that never stops slinking under the door. You brace your elbows on your knees and finally taste the stew. The first bite is salt and salmos, and you swallow fast to keep your body from staging a protest. You remind yourself that in a few minutes, your hunger will dull the details. That's the hope. Anyway, meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but if you could power it up, you'd probably be searching whether it's normal for a preserved fish to taste like old rope. Here, you'll just have to assume it is. You set the bowl aside after a few mouthfuls. Your hands are stiff again, fingers aching in the chill. You rub your knuckles together and watch the fire's glow waver as the wind rattles the turf roof. The daylight never truly left, only sank into a dim half-light that makes every corner feel like it's holding a secret. And speaking of secrets, you still have one more task-salting meat that's meant to last through the endless days when the sun refuses to set. You rise with a groan, knees protesting, and cross to the wooden trough by the wall. A haunch of lamb rests there, salted to the point of mummification. You brush away a few stray grains of salt, feeling how firm the flesh has become. Historians still argue whether this preservation method was effective or merely optimistic, considering the perpetual damp you hold the meat to the table. Merely losing your grip as your palms slip on the greasy surface, you steady it with your hip and reach for the knife short. Broad blade that feels heavier than it looks. The wind gives the wall another good shove as if to remind you you're never really alone here. You slice into the meat carefully, sawing along old lines where salt has formed pale ridges. The smell is powerful, sharp, and earthy, tinged with something you'd rather not name. Remember that tunic? It's clinging damply to your spine again, and you give up on ever feeling properly dry. You carve thin slices, stacking them in a shallow dish. Each piece looks the same, pinkish-gray and veined with white fat that gleams under the flickering light. You pause to flex your hand, feeling the ache of repetition seep into your wrist. Meanwhile, your stomach growls again, though you can't tell if it's encouragement or warning. You set the knife aside and sprinkle more salt over the exposed surface of the haunch, watching it vanish into the cracks. You are not just seasoning, you're preserving hope that this meat will last through the months when the wind never stops and the fields yield no thing but ice. You think about modern freezers cold at the press of a button, reliable, effortless. Here, the closest thing is a cellar dug into the permafrost, and even that's no guarantee. You pack the slices tighter, pressing them flat with the heel of your hand. Remember the first time you imagined yourself in this kitchen? Maybe you pictured a quaint little hearth, the coziness of old wood and stone. The reality is a little less romantic. Salt that scours your skin raw, smoke that chokes you, and meat that feels more artifact than food. You set the knife down and look at your handiwork. The haunch is a little smaller now, but still substantial enough to feed you if you ration carefully. You drape a cloth over it, a thin, scratchy weave that smells faintly of old wool, and secure it with a loop of twine. Outside, the wind picks up again, driving a fine mist of rain against the walls. You close your eyes and listen to it drumming on the turf. For a moment, you imagine you're somewhere else, a place where dinner comes without this much effort, a place where the roof doesn't leak and the food doesn't fight you for dominance. But when you open your eyes, you're still here, still surrounded by walls that seem determined to return to the earth. Still cradling a bowl of stew that never quite loses its sour tang. You lift the cup of ale, swirling the last mouthful. It's gone warm and flat, but you drink it anyway. It's a small defiance in a place where everything feels designed to test your patience. Remember the seabird eggs you cooked on that flat stone? The memory drifts through your mind like smoke, mingling with the knowledge that soon you'll have to clean every tool you've used. And then tomorrow, you'll start it all again. You stand, brush the salt from your hands, and look round the kitchen. The hearth glows low, embers blinking in the draught. Your shadow moves along the walls, tall and thin, like a warning or a promise. This is your life tonight, salting meat in the midnight sun, pretending the never-ending twilight is a kind of comfort. If you close your eyes, you can almost believe it. You rest your palms on the table's edge, feeling the grain of the wood press into your skin, and let your shoulders slump. The salted lamb haunch is covered and tucked away, at least for now. But there's no real pause in this kitchen, only the next task creeping forward. You glance across the room to the churn standing in the corner, its squat shape promising both sustenance and fresh misery. You trudge over, the rushes crackling under your steps, and wrap your hands round the wooden handle. The churn is half filled with goat's milk, thin and already separating into curds and watery liquid. You stare into it and sigh. Historians still argue whether butter in this climate was a luxury or simply an inevitability when milk refused to keep. Either way, you're about to find out firsthand how quickly a pair of frozen hands can numb every other complaint you had. You brace your hip against the churn and begin the slow, steady motion of lifting and pressing the plunger. It sloshes with a dull, squelching note that seems to echo in the rafters. After a few minutes, your palms feel stiff, the cold wood leaching the last of your warmth. You keep going, because stopping means losing what little heat your body still holds. Remember, that damp tunic. It's damp again, this time from sweat prickling under your arms and at the nape of your neck. The churn rocks gently as you work, and you picture modern stand mixers whirring cheerfully on bright countertops. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but if it worked, you'd be researching whether churns were ever designed to be more ergonomic. Probably not. You pause to flex your fingers, then resume. Each plant feels heavier than the last. Like the milk itself resents your intrusion, the thin liquid begins to thicken, turning from pale cream to a lumpy mass that clings to the sides of the barrel. A faint, sour smell rises, proof that it's working. Outside, the wind has shifted. Instead of battering the front wall, it scrapes along the roof in long, drawn-out groans. You imagine the rafters bowing under the pressure, the whole turf house sighing with you. You lean harder into the churn, teeth gritted, and press the plunger down until your shoulders burn. A ribbon of whey trickles over the rim, spattering your boots. You ignore it. You've learned by now that everything in this kitchen leaves a mark: salt, smoke, or sour milk. Remember the driftwood fire you so carefully built. It's shrunk to a few embers, pulsing feebly. You can't spare the attention to feed it yet. Your focus narrows to the churn, to the slow, steady rhythm of forcing milk to surrender to your will. At last, the lumps consolidate into a pale, dense mass. You pull the plunger free, arms trembling, and peer inside. Butter, or something that will pass for it, has formed in uneven clumps. You scrape them into a shallow bowl with the back of a spoon, pressing out the last thin rivulets of whey. Historians still argue whether medieval Icelanders saw butter as a delicacy or a practical necessity. You think it's simply the only way to keep milk from turning into something you'd rather not drink. You set the churn aside and wipe your hands on your tunic, leaving pale streaks of cream across the soot-darkened fabric. You rub your knuckles, feeling the burn in every joint, then turn back to the hearth. Remember the seabird eggs you cooked earlier. The smell of them has woven itself into the kitchen's very walls. And now the tang of fresh butter is layered on top. It's a scent that will never fully leave your hair. You feed the fire the last scrap of driftwood, watching the flames leap up in a final effort. The light spills across the floor, illuminating the churn, the salted meat, the bowls of unappealing stew. You crouch and rest your elbows on your knees, letting the warmth wash over your chilled hands. Meanwhile, your stomach makes another hollow complaint, but you ignore it. There are still a few steps left before you can sit down properly to eat. You stand and move to the low shelf where a stack of coarse cloths waits. You'll need one to wrap the butter and keep it from spoiling too quickly. You spread a cloth across the table, then tip the butter into its center. The mass is cool and a little gritty. Flecked with traces of the churn, you shape it into a rough ball. Then fold the cloth over it like a swaddled infant. Remember that modern fridge you once pictured, the place where butter stays fresh without any ceremony. Here, you're left with this, a cloth, a cold shelf, and the hope that the spirit in the hearth is feeling generous. You tuck the wrapped butter into a corner near the door, where the draft will keep it from turning rancid too soon. The wind whistles through the cracks in the frame, chilling your knuckles. You close your eyes, just for a second, and feel the exhaustion catch up to you all at once. When you open them, nothing has improved. The wind is still howling, the fire is still fading, the kitchen still smells like a dare, but the butter is finished, and that feels like a small triumph. You straighten. Brush your palms against your thighs and look round at the dim, smoky space you've come to know far too well. The churn, the pot, the rack of iron tools, all of it has blurred together into a single ritual you'll repeat again tomorrow. Remember when you thought you'd be here for just a meal? Now it feels like you've lived a lifetime in this kitchen. You turn back to the hearth, feeling the draft wrap round your ankles. This is dinner, churned by frozen hands, flavored by driftwood smoke, and endured with a kind of grim affection you can't quite explain. You ease the churn aside and set your palms on the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood press into your skin like a quiet accusation. You haven't finished yet. No matter how many tasks you cross off, the kitchen always seems to produce another. Tonight, that means flatbread baked on stones that never quite stay the right temperature. You turn to the corner where the stones are stacked in a haphazard pile, each one scorched black from years of half-successful baking attempts. Historians still argue whether this method came from necessity or sheer stubbornness. You suspect a bit of both. You pick the flattest stone and carry it to the hearth. Settling it among the remaining embers, it tilts to one side, threatening to spill itself into the ashes. You wedge a chunk of driftwood underneath to brace it. The fire's glow spills over your hands, bringing back sensation to your stiff fingers. Remember that damp tunic? By now it feels as if it's fused with your skin, a permanent second layer steeped in old smoke and salt. You shift your shoulders, but it doesn't help. You know it won't. You glance at the bowl of barley flour you ground earlier. The last handful left for this final test of patience. You mix it with a little water, stirring until it forms a paste just stiff enough to hold its shape. It's not much, but it's all you have. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead. But if it weren't, you'd be Googling how to bake anything without losing your will to live. You imagine a bright, glossy video with cheerful music and clear instructions instead. You have a smoky kitchen, a fire that's almost dead, and a stone you hope will hold enough heat to finish the job. You kneel by the hearth and spoon the batter onto the slab, spreading it into a rough disc. It hisses as it hits the hot surface, the edges crisping almost immediately. For a heartbeat, you feel something close to relief. At least this step is predictable if you don't look away. If you don't move too slowly, you might even end up with something edible. The wind moans under the eaves again, pushing a draft across your cheek. You glance at the door to make sure it hasn't swung open. Every part of this kitchen feels like it wants to let the outside in, Remember the seabird eggs you cracked earlier? The same smell still drifts round you, mixing with the faint scent of baking grain. You tell yourself it could be worse. It could always be worse. You flip the flat bread with the edge of your spoon. The underside is already blackened in spots. You sigh. Perfection isn't possible here, only adequacy, only survival. You set another dollop of dough beside the first, letting it sizzle in the residual heat. You know the stone is cooling by the minute, and you won't get many chances before it's too cold to bake anything at all. The second round cooks a little slower, the edges curling instead of crisping. You lift it to check and nearly burn your fingers on a patch of glowing ash. You brush it off, pretending the grit is seasoning. Meanwhile, your stomach sends up another hollow ache. And you remind yourself that this is still better than nothing. You imagine a modern oven preheated to exactly the right temperature. Here, you crouch over a half-dead fire, one eye on the dough and the other on the embers, willing them not to give out completely. Historians still argue whether these flatbreads were daily fare or occasional indulgence. You suspect it depended on whether there was anything else to eat. You flip the second bread again, feeling the stiff edge with your fingertips. It's done enough, no sense waiting for it to turn golden when your fire is halfway to memory. You stack it on the first, then scrape the last of the batter into a lumpy disc. Remember the driftwood you scavenged on that freezing shore. This is the final heat it will ever give you. You watch the flame dwindle, feeling a pang of gratitude you didn't expect. Even a reluctant fire is still a fire. The last bread bakes slowly. Refusing to hurry, you crouch there, one hand propped on the hearthstone, and watch every bubble rise and collapse. You realize, a little distantly, that you're exhausted in a way that goes beyond fatigue, the kind of tired that settles in your bones. When you lift the bread free, the underside is charred in a crescent where the stone was hottest. You tap it with your fingernail, listening for the dull thud that means it's cooked through. Good enough. You stack the bread on a wooden plate, brushing off stray ash, and carry it to the table. 3 lopsided discs, tangible proof you've survived another hour in this place. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but in this kitchen, that almost feels like a kindness. No reminders of what you're missing, no evidence of any other way to live. You glance round the room, low rafters, soot-black walls, the embers giving off their last thin glow. You remember the first time you looked in the pot and thought you'd never get used to the smell. Now you don't even notice it until you step away. You set the plate down and rub your palms together, feeling the sting of dry skin scraped raw by flour and smoke. This is your bread burnt in places and done in others, but yours all the same. Remember that bright, modern kitchen you imagined, stainless steel, gleaming tiles. It doesn't exist here. Here, it's just you, the fire, and whatever you can coax from barley and driftwood. You sink onto the bench, flat bread warm against your palms, and take a slow breath in this moment. The kitchen feels almost peaceful so long as you don't think too hard about how much work still waits in the shadows. You break off a corner of the flatbread and chew slowly, feeling grit crunch between your teeth where ash clings stubbornly to the crust. The taste is not exactly pleasant, but it's familiar, and that counts for something here. You swallow and look down at your hands, noticing the lines of flour ground into every crease of your skin. The embers have faded to a dull glow, and a fine ash drifts up in lazy swirls each time the wind finds another crack in the turf walls. You rub your palms together, trying to warm them, and consider the final component of tonight's questionable banquet, seaweed and blubber. You stand, feeling the stiffness in your knees, and cross to the basket where the dried seaweed waits, tangled in brittle sheets the color of old leather. Historians still argue whether it was prized as a vegetable or merely tolerated because it was all the ocean would give. Either way, it's about to become dinner. Remember that damp tunic? The sleeves have dried. But now the shoulders are damp again where the sea spray found you earlier. You pull the fabric away from your skin and sigh. In this kitchen, you're never really dry. You gather a handful of seaweed and carry it to the table. It rustles in your grip like paper, shedding little flakes with every step. You break it into smaller pieces, trying not to think about how long it's been sitting in that basket. Some of the edges are tinged with white salt. You tell yourself firmly, though your imagination suggests otherwise. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but you almost laugh, because if it weren't, you'd be searching whether this combination has ever been considered edible anywhere else on Earth. You fetch the small lump of whale blubber from the shelf near the door. It's waxy under your fingers, and as you set it on the cutting board, it gleams dully in the half-light. You cut it into strips, each slice sticking to the blade for a heartbeat before flopping free. The smell is faintly fishy, layered over with something richer and harder to define like candle wax left in the sun too long. You drag the pot back onto the hotter part of the hearth and tip in the blubber. It melts slowly, surrendering to the heat with a few soft pops. The seaweed follows, sinking into the shallow pool of oil with a sound that almost makes you flinch. You stir carefully, watching it darken and soften. Remember the rushes under your feet. There's hardly any left, just a few flattened stems stuck in the mud floor. You scrape one aside with your heel and crouch closer to the hearth. The mixture simmers, bubbles rising to the surface in slow, deliberate intervals. You lean back to avoid the worst of the steam, but it still settles over you, clinging to your hair and dampening your face. The smell is pungent, earthy, and surprisingly rich. For a moment, you almost imagine you're cooking something luxurious, almost. Historians still argue whether seaweed and blubber stews were reserved for lean times or simply a staple meal. You suspect the truth is both necessity dressed up as tradition. You stir the pot again, feeling the mixture thicken into something less watery, more substantial. A film begins to form along the rim, and you scrape it back down with the ladle, telling yourself it's all part of the process. Outside, the wind rattles the turf walls with a steady determination. You wonder if it ever really stops or if you've just grown numb to it. You glance at the door to be sure it's still latched. In here, it's easy to imagine the weather as a living thing trying to get in. Meanwhile, your stomach grumbles, either hopeful or resentful. You can't decide. You dip the ladle and test a spoonful of the stew. The taste is unusual, salty, oily, with a brine so strong you nearly cough. You swallow and tap the spoon against the pot's edge. It's not good, but it's not poison, and that's the standard tonight. Remember when you imagined a modern meal: fresh vegetables, warm bread, clean plates. Here, dinner is something scraped together from whatever the sea and the cold haven't claimed. You ladle the stew into a shallow bowl, watching it glisten under the flickering firelight. Bits of seaweed drift among tiny drops of oil, shimmering like an unappetizing constellation. You set the bowl on the table and wipe your palms on your tunic. Though the smear of grease only spreads, the embers are dying again. And you know there's no more driftwood to feed them. You crouch, coaxing the last heat forward with the poker. The faint glow brightens for a moment before settling into a sullen pulse. You let it be. There's no sense fighting it anymore. You sit on the bench with your back to the wall, bull in hand. The rushes crackle faintly as you shift your weight. You take a slow bite, and the taste floods your senses: salt, smoke, and the faint sweetness of blubber that clings to your tongue long after you've swallowed. Remember, The churn you worked until your arm shook. The butter is cooling in the corner, wrapped and waiting for tomorrow. This is how you live here, a procession of small labors, each one a way to keep the dark and the hunger from swallowing you. You set the bowl aside after a few mouthfuls, rubbing your knuckles into your eyes. Outside, the wind soughs along the roof, as if to say there's no end to any of this. Maybe there isn't. But here you are, still eating, still string, still surviving. For tonight, that's enough. You drag your palm down your face, feeling the grease from the seaweeds to sink into your skin. And tell yourself there's only one more ordeal before you can sit still for longer than a moment. You set the half-finished bowl on the shelf and turn toward the low crate near the hearth, where a few knobby roots and withered carrots slump together like a defeated army. Historians still argue whether vegetables in medieval Iceland were a sign of prosperity or a reminder that soil barely tolerated anything but grass. As you lift a carrot with a split down the side, you suspect it's more of a reluctant compromise. You gather the roots into a wooden bowl and carry them to the table, feeling your shoulders sag under their unimpressive weight. Remember that. Damp tunic. It's finally drying again, though it's stiff as a sail from layers of smoke and brine. You can almost imagine it standing on its own if you peeled it off. The knife you used on the salted lamb waits by the edge of the table, blade crusted with the last of the fat. You wipe it on your sleeve because there are no clean cloths left and begin trimming the roots. Each cut is a small rebellion against the idea that this is the best supper you could hope for. The carrots split and crumble under the blade, sending up a faintly sweet smell. You street them into a pile, then start on the turnips, their skin tough and pitted from months of storage. You know you're supposed to be grateful for any fresh food at all. Sometimes you almost manage it. Outside, the wind finds a new seam in the turf wall and whistles through with a note so high it makes your teeth ache. You pause, the knife held midair, and look round the kitchen as if expecting something to snap under the pressure. But nothing does. It's just the same walls, the same smoke, the same relentless draft. Remember the brittle rushes you wore down to dust? What's left is scattered in little drifts along the edges of the floor. You shuffle your feet, and they whisper against the mud like dry paper. You scoop the vegetables into a small pot, tip in the last of the way, and carry it to the hearth. The embers barely have enough strength left to warm the bottom, but you set the pot down anyway, because you don't have the energy to coax another flame to life. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead. But if it weren't, you'd be looking up. Whether cooking in near darkness was really standard or if you've just made a string of questionable decisions. You sigh and crouch, feeling your knees protest as you stir the pot. The roots begin to soften, shedding a cloud of steam that curls round your face. You close your eyes and breathe in the damp. Salty air. The warmth is a small relief against the draft crawling up your spine. You stand slowly, bracing your hand on the wall. Your back is a single, steady ache that no amount of stretching will fix. You tell yourself you'll sit down soon. But first, you have to see this meal through to the end. Remember the driftwood you gathered on that icy shore? The last of it is ash now, graying the hearthstones and settling into every fold of your clothes. You wipe your palms on your tunic out of habit. Though there's nothing left to clean, you tip the pot, letting a little broth spill onto your spoon. The taste is thin and sour, but at least the roots have softened enough to chew without effort. You stir again, more out of stubbornness than hope, and set the spoon aside. Historians still argue whether these meals were an exercise in resilience or simply desperation. You're convinced it's both. The wind rattles the door in its frame, a hollow, rhythmic thud that makes you wonder if it's trying to get in or get you out. You glance at the latch, then at the wavering firelight, and feel a sudden, irrational urge to bolt into the night just to be somewhere else, anywhere else. But you don't. You crouch again. Wrap your hand round the pot handle and lift it carefully. Onto a flat stone to cool, the steam rises in a white ribbon that disappears into the shadows above your head. You ease yourself onto the bench, shoulders drooping. The rushes crunch under your boots. Remember the seaweed and blubber you stewed. Its smell still clings to the walls, layered over the tang of boiled roots and stale smoke. Meanwhile, your stomach makes a tentative noise that could be hunger or protest. You ignore it and press your palms to your thighs, feeling the last warmth. From the hearth seep into your bones. You break off a piece of flat bread and dip it into the broth, chewing with deliberate slowness. The taste isn't good, but it's enough to quiet the itch of emptiness that's been gnawing at you since the moment you stepped inside. You glance at the churn in the corner, the stack of half-burned driftwood, the blackened pot, every inch. This kitchen bears the marks of effort you'd rather not remember. But here you are, with a bowl of food, a flicker of firelight, and the certainty that tomorrow you'll do it all again. Remember the bright kitchens you once imagined warm, clean, easy. In this place, you learn to let go of ideas like that. You learn to measure comfort in smaller increments. A crust of bread that doesn't crumble, a draft that doesn't quite reach your neck, a meal that doesn't make you gag outright. You look round one more time and sigh. This is your night in medieval Iceland, dicing roots in relentless wind, hoping that tomorrow the fire will be easier to start. You sit very still, the whale oil lamp guttering beside you, and listen to the hush of the kitchen wrapping itself around the last of your resolve. The stew bowl is nearly empty. The flat bread reduced to a few blackened edges, the smoked fish, a glistening spine. You think you should feel accomplished, but mostly you just feel hollowed out, like the pot you spent all night scraping clean and refilling. Remember that damp tunic. It's cold again, where the lamp's heat can't quite reach your shoulders. You tug the collar higher, but the cloth has stiffened into a shape that doesn't yield to you anymore. You wonder if this is how the house feels, stubbornly clinging to what little warmth it can. Long after it stopped expecting comfort, you stand slowly, knees locking before they remember how to bend, and shuffle toward the corner where the sand bucket waits. You've avoided this moment as long as you could, but the meal is over, and the last task remains: cleaning. Not the bright sparkle of modern tidying, but the grim ritual of scraping and scouring in water too cold to pretend it. Warmth. You tip the bucket to test the weight, half full of gritty sand, seawater, and the memory of every meal that came before tonight's. Historians still argue whether cleaning with sand was truly effective or just a habit no one questioned in him. Or you imagine they'd have plenty too, say if they were standing here, watching you brace your shoulders for the final effort. Meanwhile, your phone is still dead, but you'd almost welcome a glowing screen to distract you from the slow dread creeping up your spine. Instead, there's just the quiet hiss of the wind pressing its face to the door. You kneel by the hearth, where the pot still sits, rim-crusted in the last of the stew. Your hands ache before you even touch it. You dip your rag into the bucket and swipe it over the iron, feeling the cold seep into your knuckles like a promise. The sand grates under your palm, grinding away residue in fits and starts. Remember the brittle rushes that cushioned your knees? Gone now, ground into the floor. You shift, and the cold earth bites through the thin layer of your trousers. You think about moving faster, but the stiffness in your hands says you won't. You scrub the pot until the surface feels almost smooth again. Almost. You set it aside and reach for the wooden bowls, each one harboring its own share of grease and Crumbs, the whale oil lamp flickers over your shoulder, making every motion look slow and dreamlike. You're too tired to resent it. You rinse each bowl in seawater, feeling the salt bite into the cracks in your skin. You think of modern sinks, warm tap water, soap that smells like something pleasant. You watch the cold water swirl around your wrists, and you can't imagine what it would feel like to be clean. Remember the churn you worked until your arms went numb. Its lid is still propped open, the last streaks of butter clinging to the rim. You wipe it out with the same rag, which has long since given up any pretense of actually cleaning. Outside, the wind gives a final shove to the door before settling into a weary sigh. The hush that follows feels too big for the little room to hold. You glance at the lamp and know it will die soon, when the last of the oil curls into smoke. Historians still argue whether these endless evenings bred resilience or simply exhausted everyone until 50 no one had energy left to care. You wonder which camp you'd belong to. If you had a choice, you set the churn lid back in place and push yourself upright. Your knees crack like green branches. The pot is as clean as it will ever be, and the bowls are stacked in a neat, if grimy, pile. You rub your palms together, feeling the grit there, and look around the kitchen one last time. Remember when you thought you'd just visit this place for a night. Now it feels like you've always been here, moving from task to task, measuring success in inches, in warmth that never lasts, in the small relief of finishing one more chore. You lift the lamp and watch your shadow shiver along the wall. The rushes are gone. The fire is out. The kitchen is finally quiet. This is cleaning up with sand and cold water. An ending that feels like it could start all over again at any moment. And tomorrow, it will. Tonight you've traveled far across the threshold of a kitchen that never meant to feel welcoming, into a world where every meal is an exercise in stubborn endurance. You've scoured pots that never stay clean, stirred stews that never taste quite right, and watched the last embers of your driftwood fire fade into the darkness. Now, your story can rest. There is no more smoke curling round your hair, no more sour whey waiting to be ladled, no more rushes to crush underfoot. Just this moment soft, hushed, and finally still. Let the cold drift away, and the memories of salt and blubber and barley ease into the background. Close your eyes. If you haven't already, breathe in the thought that tomorrow you will wake somewhere warmer, cleaner, and easier. The lamp you carried to the table flickers down to a tiny ember. The walls stop creaking. Even the wind quiets to a tired sigh. You've earned this slowness. You've earned the quiet. You've earned the simple relief of knowing that the only thing left to do is rest. Tonight, you can be grateful for warm blankets, for electric light, for food that does not fight you back. You can be grateful for the small mercies that modern life provides: soft towels, gentle heat, fresh water from a tap. Let the old kitchen fade behind you. Let the damp tunic slip away. Let yourself drift into the soft dark with the knowledge that you have survived what came before, and you are safe where you're now. Thank you for spending your evening here. Sleep well.